So I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and I had a loving family, but unfortunately it was also a broken home. And if you've ever met a child of divorce, it's really hard on them, and it was hard on me. But two of the great things that got me through it were, one, getting to go to Lady Lodge camps as a kid. But the other one was that I had a youth pastor named Scott Buchanan that invested in me and some of my friends' lives. And one of the things he did was take us from San Antonio out to Oregon every summer. So that's me there in the green shirt, the kind of troubled-looking young man there. And when we would go out there, he'd assign us each a special tool. So some people got tents, some people got furnaces to cook food on, and I received the shovel. So I was the keeper of the shovel. And if you've ever been camping, you know that the shovel is not really all that glamorous of a tool, right? It's a tool that you use to make bathrooms. But in the end, I think that it was something that was important to our group. It was important for our survival. And I think it taught me something about the role of tools and technology in our lives. But today, I don't want to ask us about the tools and technology we need to survive. I want to ask a different question, and it's this. It's, what technology will you bring with you to heaven? Now, I realize this sounds a little bit, maybe even heretical, and the organizers are starting to get a little bit worried about having me here. But I think that if we answer this question correctly, and we take into account certainly all the things that Jesus says about not storing up for ourselves treasures on earth, thinking about heavenly treasures, about how we can't take any of the things that we have, our clothes or our money, we can't take any of those things to heaven. But I think when rightly read, and when we look through the whole story of God, I think we also see that some of the tools and technology that we use today may end up there. And I think with that knowledge, that actually helps us know how to use technology today. Now, before we get into that, I want to say I'm talking about technology in a very, very broad sense. I don't simply mean the internet-connected devices that we all had to silence a few minutes ago. I also mean shovels and simple tools like that. I mean the tiny ones that are embedded in some of our hearts. I also mean some of the more complicated things that are coming down the road, and even the business processes that you create in your companies. The things that are intangible that you can't see, but they run in a technique kind of way, the things that you do, and they make your businesses happen. All of that is in view here of the things that we create as humanity. But first, I want to mention a couple of the downsides that are happening right now. We all know that there is not a week that goes by in the news without some kind of data breach. Companies are stealing from each other. Businesses and governments are stealing from each other. Hackers are taking people's personal and private and intimate photos. There are all kinds of difficulties out there with technology. And as Christians, of course, we want to be lights into those areas. But even beyond some of the explicit sort of bad things, there's also what Kathleen mentioned earlier today. Some of the things that happen when we automate things, we often change people's jobs. So when the very first printing press came along and it took away the jobs of the scribes, that was difficult. Even the word Luddite comes from a group of people who are worried about their jobs being taken away by new automation. And robots today, they're starting to look at some of the jobs that we have and maybe taking them over. So the more than 3.5 million Americans who work in the transportation industry, those jobs are going to change as self-driving cars come on the market. And even doctors and lawyers, it may be that a machine can actually do a better job of working through all the complexities of prescribing drugs or looking through legal documents. So all of our jobs are going to be affected by this. And this isn't something that is explicitly immoral, but it's something that as believers, we want to look at how do we encourage human flourishing in a world where technology is constantly disrupting things. And I think the best place for us to look is actually in the biblical story. The whole story as it all relates together. So in a few minutes, we'll hear talks about ethics and how to live ethically through the scriptures. We'll talk about evangelism. But here, what I have in mind is technology itself and work itself as worship, as something that we do unto God that is valuable in and of itself. And I think we see this right from the beginning. When God, in the very first verse, the very first chapter, the very first book of the Bible, he is seen as a creative God. And later on, we are told that we have been made in his image. And theologians have broken many a keyboard talking about what the image of God means, right? But at least some of that means our creativity, the things that we make. And not just finger paints and artistry and music, but also technology and business processes. All of this stuff, whether we mean it to or not, all of these things reflect the image of God. And when we get into Genesis 2, and we look there and God says, he's looking at the garden, he's saying, there's something almost amiss here. And what he says is that there's no one there to work it. There's no one there to do anything with it. I know my kids love Legos at home. And sometimes I come in and I accidentally step on a Lego and I'm like, oh man, would you just do something with these Legos? I almost think that what God is saying is that creation is kind of like a big bunch of Legos. There's nothing wrong with it in and of itself. But our job is to make something from what he's made. So that Hebrew word for cultivate or work always has in mind the use of tools. So from the very beginning in the garden, God has this use of tools in mind. But he doesn't tell us just to make and to create. There's two Hebrew words there. One of them is this idea of making and creating, and the other one there is guarding or keeping or preserving. And these two need to be in balance. So when you woke up this morning, you might have looked on your nightstand here in the hotel, and it says something to the effect of that we're not going to wash your sheets except for every 3 days. And the reason for that is because even though we have all of these machines and we could wash every day, we want to be good stewards of what God's given us. And this is where we get our doctrine of creation care, that any of us who work in industries where we use natural resources, we know that we can't just make whatever we want, however we want. But at the same time, we need to be cognizant of preserving God's good earth. And this is also true of our human capital, of the people that work for us, that we can't just expect them to be 24/7 on all the time like our machines are, that they need rest. That here in the creation we see that God works for 6 days and he has a Sabbath rest for the 7th day. And that rest cycle, however we work that out in our own lives, is very, very deeply important. I know that some of you have worked your whole lives to say that work in and of itself is good to God. Not work for what it can produce, not work so that you can make money and give to the church. That's a byproduct. But work in and of itself is a good thing. I think we need to reclaim that of the Sabbath as well. The Sabbath is not just good because it makes you work better the other 6 days. It's not just good because it makes the chicken better for the next 6 days, right? That's a byproduct. But the Sabbath in and of itself is good. And we in the Faith and Work movement need to reclaim that, especially in the technology always on world. We need to make sure that the Sabbath is a deep part of what we do in our acts of making and preserving. Well, that was the good part. That was creation, right? And then we move into the fall. And I think it's funny that this company uses this symbol. In Steve Jobs' defense, they didn't mean this to be theological. They just thought it looked like a cherry, so they put the cut out. But it is a fun way of reminding us that sometimes technology becomes a kind of a false hope, doesn't it? But even after Adam and Eve, when they introduced sin into the world, their very first action after they hid, you know what it was? It was an act of making. They looked at the world, they looked at their surroundings, they were made in the image of God, and they created something to overcome a problem. They said, I see this world's going to be hard, I should make clothes. And we don't normally think of that as a tool or a technology, but it accomplished something for them. And when God comes along and he addresses their sin and all the problems they've introduced, what he says about their objects of making, do you remember what it was? It was, hey, really good job. Let me show you how to do it a little bit better. And so he comes along, and there's all this theological import there, right, where they're trying to cover their sins by themselves, and God is saying, I'm going to have to sacrifice something. I'm going to have to kill something to really cover your sin and meet your deepest needs. But at the same time, I think he's telling us that what we do with technology, we can actually overcome some of the effects of the fall with it. Part of what we do with technology is not just making things more, better, and faster, which is kind of the mantra of the current IT and technology movement, but we can make things more human. We can overcome some of the things that God said about work being difficult and long. We can look at our employees and say, what do they need? Is it a standing desk? Is it time to work at home? I think even Facebook and Google get this. You probably saw their recent announcement in the last few weeks where they're allowing women to freeze their eggs so they can have a little bit more control over their work environment. Now, I'm sure we could debate whether or not that's good or bad or forces women into a bad situation. But what I think is interesting about it is that Google and Facebook are recognizing we can use technology to overcome some of the things that are happening. We can't make everything better. We can't take away what's going on in people's souls, but we can overcome some of the effects of the fall. Then when we move into the story of redemption, we see time and time again that God uses technology in the story even when he doesn't have to. So remember this movie that came out with the rock monsters and all that stuff? Well, believe it or not, I think what's happening here is that God could have levitated Noah and wiped everybody out. But instead he says, you know what? I want to make an object of human making, a technology, to be a deep part of the story of what God is doing to redeem people in the world. Certainly this is symbolic of the one who is to come, a righteous man and an object of wood, among death and destruction, saving the human race. It certainly looks forward to Christ, but also says to God that things that we make are important to him. And we see this too when we look forward into the end of Exodus, where the very first time that the Spirit of God descends upon a man, it's not a prophet or a priest or a king. It's not Abraham or Moses. It's this guy. It's Bezalel. It's a man who was tasked with making things. And his job was to say, all the theology that Moses has, what I want you to do is to make this into something that transforms that whole ancient Near Eastern world. I want you to make things that are unmistakably different. You can do anything you want, you just can't make idols. And Bezalel did a great job of that, and he turned that world upside down. And when we think about the technological world, we realize that it's constantly causing disruptions, right? When we go from live music to recorded music, we really change the interaction of the artist to the audience. That changes when we move to recorded music, and it changes again when we move over to headphones. Now, the audience members relate to one another differently. So we can't just assume that technology will always make things a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more anything. We have to know that it's always going to change and disrupt things. And even at the business layer, these new media that came about, they didn't, again, just make music more accessible. They really reshaped the entire music industry. There was a reason why music executives didn't like MP3s, because they knew that it represented something radical and changing. And I think this tells us that we can use technology to purposefully change things. I think even in Jesus' life, we see this role of technology. In fact, Jesus is given this title in Scripture of tectone. Tectone is the Greek word from which we get our own word, technology. And we translate it as carpenter. And the reason for that is we think the kind of technology that Jesus worked with was wood and nails. What I find endlessly fascinating about this is that Jesus was the one who created all of humanity, and humanity turned on him. And he worked with wood and nails, and those wood and nails were used to kill him, such that the technology with which he worked was the technology on which he died. So that we cannot tell the gospel story. We cannot tell about redemption without referencing this technology of the cross. And yet Jesus now uses it in a way that transforms and communicates. So I think our other role for technology is not just think about it as upgrades all the time, but to also think about it as going, what are the values that I have as a Christian worker? And how can I use technology in a way that allows me to transform and communicate something powerful about who God is and the image that we bear? And then as we look forward to the end, to the restoration, when God's going to make all things right, we don't go back to the garden. We don't frolic naked in the woods. And we don't go up to heaven and play a harp on a cloud. What the end of Scripture tells us is that God's going to take all the things that we make, roads and trumpets and banners and the chairs that you're sitting on. Remember, Jesus has a throne. However literally you take that, there's something there for him to sit on. God's going to take all those things and somehow redeem them and bring them down from heaven. So that he's not interested in destroying technology or saying that stuff is bad out there. He's interested in looking at technology and saying, how can I restore this? How can I redeem this and make this worthy of a future age? Even Jesus himself, remember when he came back from the dead? He was resurrected. Do you remember one of the things that he did when he wanted to go and restore Peter? He went off and he built a fire. He was still making and creating things, even in his resurrected state. So what I think this tells us is that God isn't just concerned with saving our souls, although he is at great personal cost. He has come to eradicate sin in our lives, both today and in the future. But not just our souls, but also our bodies. He promises that he's going to resurrect our bodies. But I think what is amazing is that he also promises in some way that he's going to take the things that we make, the technology that we are creating today, and do something with it. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know if there will be iPads in heaven, but I know that there will be something of what we make today there. And so my question for myself as I make and I create things is this one of those things God could look at and be like, yeah, pretty good. It goes into heaven. Is he going to look at the things I'm making and say, that doesn't need a whole lot of restoration? This is something that's worthy of the age to come. And this gives me a goal. So that the technology and things that I do today, I want them to be worthy of that age, and I want you to do the same. Thank you very much.
Is there a particular technology that you are being contemplative about in your own life to either use in a different way or not use, restrain your use of in some way?
Yeah, well, I write digital Bible software that goes into closed countries, so I'm really involved in that area, and I think that's a great redemptive thing. Yet at the same time, I notice that my kids only see me in front of a laptop all the time. And they don't necessarily wake up with Daddy knowing that he's reading the Bible. And so sometimes I think that's a valuable thing to go back. Just like I think it's a valuable thing to write somebody a handwritten note. Sometimes using those older things communicate a lot of value to people. And so I try to have a judicious balance of the old and the new.